No sane person, and certainly not a follower of Jesus, could ever enjoy the presence of war or glorify its brutality and the unnecessary loss of lives it brings. A follower of Jesus will think twice and hard before it dares to call a war to be a just war. But most of us will agree, I believe, that the war against the Hitler's Nazi and fascist regime was a just war, despite its many misgivings. I still remember the surreal scene of multiple funerals taking place in a besieged city of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1993, to be more exact, exactly 30 years ago, almost to the date, when 7 people killed by mortars and snipers a day or two previously were buried at the same time in a city park during the short hours of absence of shelling. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. It was a sobering scene to watch. One cannot think of the atrocities of the Second World War and those committed 30 years ago in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as when we think about the war that started 1 year ago when Russia brutally attacked the sovereign state of Ukraine, without reflectively asking question if Christians can afford to stay neutral in the face of evil. We should also ask, is Christian religion an innocent victim, a neutral observer, or an active perpetrator in the war of Russia against Ukraine, just as many Christians were in Hitler's occupation of Europe and beyond? And we have to address those questions without deflection, gaslighting, without whataboutism, and without spiritualizing them away. I'm Tihomir Kukolja, and I have invited again my friend, podcaster, and speaker from Bulgaria, Andrew Nedelchev, to join me again in a follow-up and honest conversation after the one we shared almost 1 year ago in the early days of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And Andrew, to begin with, I will ask, what are the overall attitudes of Christians towards the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine 1 year later? Let's begin with this question, Andrew, and see wherever it takes us.
On one level, we're still seeing, or at least I'm still seeing, the same kind of reactions among the Christian community that was evident from the very first days of the war. There are those of us that are absolutely outraged at what Putin's armies are doing, outraged at the fact that in the 21st century, after the historic lessons from the previous century, the two world wars, the threat of nuclear war from the period of the Iron Curtain and so on. After all these things that have passed, and we should have learned our lessons from these, there's still a crazy leader like Putin that is willing to wage war in the way and to the extent that he's doing in Ukraine. Absolutely outrageous. And there are many of us that can't believe it. Now we do, because we're seeing it with our eyes, and we think this should never happen again, that he should be stopped in any way possible, and that should not continue. On the other hand, there are lots of Christians who are saying, "Oh, it's not as black and white as you're making it sound. Actually, the UN is to be blamed. We can understand the reaction of Putin in Russia because they were losing so much by the aggressive expansion of UN forces and the West in general. And then there's the third party, which is just outwardly, very blatantly pro-Putin, saying yes, the U.S. is the real aggressor. The U.S. has been doing that all over the world without any punishment, and they would cite examples like Vietnam and then Iraq and all, many others. just blatantly taking the side of Russia. I'm seeing the same reaction still, with the only difference that the pro-Putin party has become a lot lower profile, so you don't hear them as much. And the middle party, which is saying, it's a lot more complex, so we don't want to take sides, which I and many others would say, refusing to take a side in this conflict is actually taking Putin's side. You can't be neutral. There is just no space for neutrality. You're either for or against it. You either approve what Putin's cohorts are doing in Ukraine, or you're against it. The moment you say, well, it's a lot more complex, so I'm gonna stay neutral and not condemn the reports which are coming from what Putin is doing in Ukraine, that makes you someone who's supporting it. So I take this position, and so I would say a lot of this neutral party Christians have become very silent. I know they're there. You hear their positions when they feel confident that they're mostly among people that think like them, that share their opinions, but otherwise they kind of stay silent and don't engage too much.
My experience was at the beginning that I condemned this aggression immediately, because I was expecting, maybe I was too naive, I was expecting that, of course, what else one could do if one is follower of Jesus or a Christian, but condemn this, because to me, on the basis of what I saw, character and the nature of that aggression, which has only been re-emphasized as the war continued, is that we have a same situation as when Hitler was going against Europe. And that situation doesn't provide you with a gray space. You cannot say, I can stay neutral in a situation of, say, with the Hitler's war and fascism advancing in the middle of the last century or a little bit earlier, because the character and the nature of that aggression that was forced by Hitler's Germany was so evil and plainly evil that basically saying I'm staying neutral would be actually meaning siding with Hitler. And most of the Christians in Germany at that time, they just thought, okay, Hitler is in power, we need to respect the government and so on. So they, in their way, they stayed neutral, but actually their neutrality actually helped, I don't know how many millions of Jews and the others to end up in the concentration camps. In my view, there is not much difference between that and what we are seeing now. So when this war started, to me, it was a natural response that this war need to be condemned. This aggression need to be condemned. And that means condemning those who actually instrumentalize that aggression. And now, as the war is going on, I'm kind of finding myself in a situation where I kind of am being careful. How do I express my view that this war is evil? Because I don't know, in your experience, you say there are fewer of those people. In my experience, the voices that I hear around, I think there are more people who are neutral in that way. And basically, the moment you condemn the war, they are coming over you in the name of Jesus. You just calm down. You don't know all the facts. Things are not as black and white as you have mentioned it. We don't know everything that is going on. And so on. Or they think that they are really Christian if they are equalizing the guilt. All of them, yeah, Putin is bad, but Ukraine is bad, and NATO is bad, European Union is bad, USA is bad. Everyone is evil in this war. Everyone is. So we better be cautious and say nothing. And I am being reminded on the words of Bonhoeffer, who said that if you find yourself in a vehicle driven by a madman, as a Christian, it is not enough just to pray about the situation or take care of the wounded and the dead. You have to help the steering wheel to be taken out of the hands of the madman who is driving this vehicle. I find myself in a really kind of interesting situation, asking myself, how do I speak about this war? Because I would immediately offend some people. Or some people will come back to me trying to remind me about where I need to be as a Christian. And basically that means say nothing, do nothing, let them do everything what they want.
There's a need for people that are willing to say what they think. And of course I'm assuming, and that doesn't need saying between us, because I know you enough to know that before you actually voice something that is offensive, you would have thought, you would have critically examined it yourself, you would be pretty convinced that it needs to be said. But once we've gone through that critical self-examination and so on, I think there is a desperate need for offensive Christians, if you say it that way. Maybe we were naive for various reasons, because we forgot that, like you say, in the days of Hitler, it wasn't just the fascists that were carrying weapons that supported him. There were plenty of Germans that supported him. I think we've also forgotten the fact that there were people in the West, people in England, people in France, people in the US who actually supported Hitler and thought, that they would have been happy if he continued and build a third glorious Reich. So we're saying this, we're seeing the same thing now. We're discovering that among our Christian communities, there are people that actually think differently, share different values, even though we both claim to be Christians. We're not the same. We evaluate the situation differently. We evaluate it differently because we're evaluating it according to a different set of values. We are prioritizing different values. And as a result, we're reaching different conclusions. Yeah, one of the most difficult things that I've had to face in relation to the war in Ukraine, and it wasn't just me, it was, we were doing this podcast with two other friends. One of them is a pastor, another one is a business guy. All three of us are Christians. It took us quite a bit of time to reach the conclusion that those Christians that are supporting the neutral party line, they're not just misinformed, they're actually making a moral choice. And they're not making it ignorantly. Maybe they're not seeing the whole picture. Who in the history of humanity has ever committed a crime seeing the whole picture? So there is always the sense that you don't see everything, but they see enough. They've seen plenty of the picture to allow them to actually make a moral choice. And we're shocked by the fact that the moral choice is evil. And so we've come to conclude that actually a number of Christians we know very well that have been part of our communities, and some of them are pastors. One of the most his videos, his live services from Sofia, he's pastor of one of the largest churches in Sofia. His videos are among the most watched. There is actually two of them, two of these pastors. Both have preached series of sermons taking the neutral side. And we've had to conclude that, it's a moral choice. It's not just being misinformed. It's just not, reading the wrong stuff. It's actually a choice being made because of many other choices that were made in these guys' lives. Hopefully they will repent and not continue in this line. But to be honest, if they do, I'm expecting we will see a lot more fruit of that line of choices. It's a very, I never expected to reach such a conclusion, because we're talking about leaders. We're talking about people that are not in jail. They haven't been condemned in court. They're people with good standing in the society. And yet we've had to conclude that these guys are actually taking the side of evil, consciously taking the side of evil. It's shattering. What do you do? And their leaders, they're still preaching their sermons, they're still leading their churches, and many of my friends are following them. And we live in a situation like that. Such clarity only takes place when you have challenging situations like wars and tragedy. So we could have never seen this. We could have never seen what these people or what any one of us would choose if there wasn't the war in Ukraine taking place and us having been forced to actually take a stand. And that has made it obvious that we've actually, people that are part of the same church, of the same community, that we thought were on the same side, now are literally standing on the opposite sides of a big border.
I've had moments when I would make a statement or write something, short video or something else, whatever it is that relates to this issue, and then in the middle of the night I would be thinking, as a Christian leader, you should really be neutral about this whole situation. And then I'm beginning to think, okay, Lord, what does this neutrality looks like, really? What does it look like? Okay, let's try to imagine being neutral in this situation. What does this look like? Well, the same way as if in the middle of the Second World War, I were neutral in the middle of Hitler's aggression. As we have already agreed, by my neutrality, being quiet, whatever, I am actually siding and empowering the violence, the evil, the loss of life, unnecessary, because we need to remember one country, sovereign country, much bigger, attacked another sovereign country. So the country that attacked this one country had no business attacking that country, had no business, no excuse under which it was legitimate to do this. And then you quickly see the results, how the number of the dead, how destruction is being brought on a massive scale. How on earth can one be neutral? But the moment you say that, immediately there are those voices telling you what you have mentioned, but what America did to Vietnam, but what happened to Iraq? And then you have to almost apologize and say, yes, people, we know that this was just as wrong, but please, we are talking right now about this situation. So let us not deflect. Let us not gaslight. Let us not do whataboutism immediately the moment we mention that this war is unjust and it needs to stop. And maybe just to bring another thing quickly before we move on. Right now, today I have read some news about Moldova. How in Moldova now some of the Moldovan citizens are practically inviting Russia to help them. And I'm reading my friend on another site said, see that not everything is black and white. This is a poor country. We don't know the whole story. And I'm thinking, goodness me, I was in that country a few months ago. Okay, only for 3 days, but long enough that I clearly saw the picture really whether the Russians are welcome to this country or not.
Yeah.
And so, should Russia be successful, we are going to have the same story about the Moldova. Let us not just let them be. We don't know everything. Things are not just black and white for us. That's not our business. So let Russia go from one country to another and reclaim, reoccupy. Because some time ago, this was part of their territory.
The larger issue is how do we think about the Russians that are in support of Putin? And I think then the question of how do we think about non-Russians, Christians in our countries, in the US and Bulgaria and Moldova, wherever, who seem to be taking the neutral side, but in reality, they're not condemning Putin. How do we think about it? It's like a continuation of the first question. What do we think about Russians that are still supporting Putin, even after all the facts? And especially about Russians who've seen, okay, I can imagine that someone who's just watching Russian official TV, they don't have access to the internet, and yet these are very few people like that. Most of the young Russians, wherever they are, even in Siberia, even in the most poorest parts of the country, they're using mobile phones, they're using mobile internet. And even though their internet is heavily censored and they don't get the full picture, they have friends, they hear stuff. But there are Russians outside of Russia who are not subjected to that heavy dose of censorship and misinformation. What happens with them? And last week, this is the specific example I wanted to give. Last week, I watched a video of a song. There's a Russian-speaking community in Sofia, an evangelical one. I was watching a video of one of these guys that had just written a new song, and he introduced the song by this 3-minute introduction, which the gist of it was condemning Bulgarians' tendency to use the name of God in vain. And within his speech, he said, it's outrageous. How can you hear Bulgarians just using the name of God in vain as if it doesn't matter? And he was saying, no one in Serbia would do that. No one in Russia would do that. And I was listening to this speech. I know the guy. I know where he comes from. And I was thinking, I know for sure, there's no doubt in my mind that Putin is not paying him to say what he's saying. But if he was being paid by the Russian propaganda, he couldn't have done a better job than what he was already doing. It was perfect. He was giving an example of Russian Christians or non-Christians, because it was both Christians and non-Christians, the culture at large, having a better attitude and more respect for God than Bulgarians. And I was saying, really? I mean, in the face of what's happening with Russia invading Ukraine, how can you even say that? It's outrageous. I know these guys very well. And for some reason, there is the same pride and sense of superiority that I'm finding in many Russians that I've known through the years. And I can't help but seeing a link there between this sense of superiority and the sense of superiority that Putin is playing on in order to gain support from normal Russians for this war. So there's almost the question, and it's very dangerous. I don't want to. We shouldn't treat it lightly, but it's the question: what is wrong with a whole people group that makes so many of them look at facts like the terrible atrocities done in Ukraine by the Russian military and paramilitary, and still refuse to condemn it? And there is no easy answer. I don't intend to say I know the answer. How do we treat, on the one hand, Russians who for some time or maybe still are supporting the war in Ukraine? And how do we treat Christians in our own communities who are playing the neutral card, but in effect are supporting Putin?
I'm thinking of a lady that I met in Romania last summer when, with a group of friends, we were running a program, or however you want to call it, to which we wanted to, in whatever way we could, somehow help the refugees in Romania from Ukraine. And I remember, the situation with a woman from Ukraine, but obviously with a family ties with with Russia. And when we dealt with the question about, what would you do if a Russian would be here right now? Would you forgive? Would you help? Which was a very tough question for that group, to be quite honest. There was this one woman who kind of was thinking, and she says, I would help him, but I would tell him the truth. And when we asked the question, what do you mean by this? Said, I would help him, but I would tell him the truth. And then she told us her story, and then it became clear to us. She said, my brother lives in Moscow, in Russia. Obviously, without asking much further, she must have had also some Russian blood, to put it like this, which is not an uncommon thing there in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And she said, I, at the beginning, when they could still talk, they spoke over on a telephone, and I was telling him what was happening in my town, in my village. And he was telling me, you are lying. You are brainwashed. Our people are not doing that. Our people have only gone there to deal with the fascism in your country, to save you. And then she said, I told my brother, but how can you tell me this? Because I am here. There's a reason why I have to run and leave my village, because I see it with my own eyes. And he says, no, you are lying. You are lying. You are lying. And that was, up to that point, I don't know what happened later, the only conversation she had with her brother, because her brother didn't want to have anything to do with his lying sister, But this lady was telling the truth, So this only gives us even a more picture how the situation is complex. And I assume that both of them, not only her, but her brother is a Christian too. And what do you do in those situations when people don't want to see it? At the beginning of this conflict, many of us had a tendency to put the blame on Putin only. People are all right. Putin was evil. And then when such a war goes on, and when other characters emerge who are in his story, you begin to realize that that's not only him, that there are even characters in Russia who might even be worse than him.
Oh, yeah.
If the power would be passed from him to them, they would probably be even worse, which makes it even more scary. And this leads us to this question, okay, how come that people don't see it? Are they so afraid? Are they so weak? Or maybe many of them agree with this philosophy that Ukraine doesn't exist, it doesn't have legitimacy to exist, and that basically Russia is only defending itself on a foreign territory. And this now leads me to a question that really I want us to all put together and talk about. The role of faith in helping to cement the attitude of aggression towards another country. Because what really scares me, humanly speaking, is this. That here we have a situation where we find a man, Putin, who is a KGB child of a Soviet Russia, coming into marriage with a Russian Orthodox Church. And you have those pictures together, the Patriarch Kirill and Putin together, affirming each other, And Putin is not stupid. He knows that he cannot have any success in this war if he appeals on communism. But if he can appeal on the sentiments of religion and faith and how great the Russian Orthodox faith is and that territory, and it's a mother of all Christianity there, and suddenly it is becoming a moral example to the rest of the world, defender of the Christian faith, not only for Russia, but for everyone else, to rescue from the perverted Christian faith of the West, standing for families, standing for moral values, calling the Ukrainians Satanists, and calling the whole war and aggression to be the holy war. We come on a very dangerous territory, because religion, while it can be a blessing on one hand, it's always the most powerful motivator for evil.
Just last week, a friend of mine had posted on Facebook a quote from a secular philosopher whose quote and book were a response to Richard Dawkins. And in effect, he was saying, Richard Dawkins's thesis of how religion is bad is terribly superficial, not well informed, not well true, and so on, which I totally agree in general. But the specific quote was saying that it was because the leaders of the Nazis had no idea that there is a God who's watching over their actions, that they built a society as evil as Nazi Germany. And basically his thesis seemed to be, he was arguing against the thesis of Richard Dawkins, who was arguing for an atheistic society, a secular society. And this philosopher was saying, you want a secular society? Well, look at Nazi Germany. This is a secular society. In a secular society where there is no respect for a creator who is going to judge each one of us, then everything goes. And you get the power and you do all kinds of evil. Someone else, who was probably a non-believer on her list of friends, had commented, but what do you think of the Inquisition? If a secular society only leads to the atrocities of Nazi Germany, what do you think about the atrocities done in the name of the Christian church in the Middle Ages? And because she started defending and saying this is irrelevant, I said, actually, I think it's very relevant. This person is raising a very good issue. We're often using the Nazis as an argument against atheism and saying, see, when you delete God, erase God from the picture, this is where you end up with. Communism, Nazism, this is the final conclusion. But we forget to look at our own yard, which is the atrocities done in the name of religion throughout history. And of course, the easy answer and the cop-out is, yeah, but these were not real Christians. And I agree, of course, they were not. But how do you then distinguish? What is the truth? And I have to confess something to you. I was part of the Renewing Your Mind camp in 2009 in Croatia. And when the invitation came, and it was all, the formula was always, we're gathering to think about how do the values of Jesus apply to politics, diplomacy, all issues, business, and so on. And I was thinking, why use the formula values of Jesus? Why not be totally open and talk about, Christian values and things like that? Nowadays, I'm totally rethinking this and realizing that it was a great approach, because I'm looking at the history of the Christian church and realizing the only thing that cannot be falsified is the personality of Jesus. Anything else, be it the authority of the church, be it the authority of the Bible, be it the authority of the Ten Commandments, whatever else is taken as a foundation or as the norm according to which we're going to create an institution or form a society, easily disintegrates and becomes a source of abuse, a tool for abuse, and terrible atrocities. The only thing that cannot be really falsified and made into evil is when you look at the personality of Jesus, with all of his humanness, with all of his approachability, with all of his Middle Easternness, all of these elements that if you're looking at a historical Jesus, you can't remove. But it's all of these details that actually ground him in reality and make you look at his values in a way that you can't that always confronts you. It never allows you to come to a position where you say, "Oh, I'm totally Christian."
Mhm.
The moment you compare yourself to a church, to a denomination, to a set of doctrines, to a set of values, you can easily say, "Well, I'm pretty much Orthodox." But when you compare yourself to the personality of Jesus, you're always in the position of, "I'm not there yet. I want to be there. I want to follow him. I'm striving to follow him in every day of my life. But there is a long way to go before I go there." He's so much higher, more full, more lively, more encapsulating everything, and so much in harmony that my life compared to his is still in shambles.
I never knew we will be actually taking this line of conversation.
I didn't too.
But I think it's fitting because we are hitting at something that's very important to understand: the abuse of Christian nationalism as a source of power to motivate the people to do the evil. And this is to make a distinction between a religion and its abuse and the person of Jesus.
Yeah.
Because I think this is not clear to many people, and they like to put us all into the same basket. Look at what your Christians are doing. I really feel honored because you have, in a few words, vindicated even my leadership of the Renewing Our Minds, this movement for 20 years. I used to work as a pastor before I took the leadership of Rome or Renewing Our Minds. But it was through the leading of the Rome I could begin to clearly see the distinction between Christianity and person of Jesus. And that what you have said, you can manipulate with Christianity, but you cannot manipulate Jesus. So when we talk about whatever we are talking now, those people who are so militant and using the umbrella of Christianity have nothing to do with the person of Jesus, who told Peter in his most sensitive moments, "Put your sword away."
Yep.
Put your sword away. There is nothing in Jesus and about Jesus that would in any way justify, inspire, or lead any kind of, especially not this kind of war that is happening right now, coming from the Russian system, whatever you want to call it, towards Ukrainians. And what is really the most cynical, let's just go a step forward. They're supposedly defending the Christian values. But it seems I have here a report issued by the Ukrainian Institute for Religious Freedom, a very fresh one, only 2 weeks ago, which states that since the beginning of the war, at least 500 religious objects, most of them predominantly Christian, and most of them Protestant and evangelical, schools, churches, so on, have been either destroyed or have been so heavily damaged that basically you can't use them anymore. It almost seems, not almost, that this is deliberate. And actually the report says that it is deliberate. That the Russians have a special appetite towards the non-Russian Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, and especially in the territories that they have claimed to be theirs now, because the numbers go high up there in those territories. And I found here several quotations, and one of the leaders of one of the Christian institutes, he said, one Russian officer told an employee of our institute that evangelical believers like you should be completely destroyed since you are sectarians and American spies. But a simple shooting will be too easy for you. You need to be buried alive. So this comes from a very official, professional report, not from hearsay. And isn't that a cynical situation, highly cynical situation, where someone who probably would consider himself to be a Christian in Russia is saying something like this to someone else who is more than likely a Christian on the Ukrainian side? So my point is this: we cannot blame Christ, God forbid. Neither can we blame Christianity as it is intended to the New Testament? But when Christianity becomes abused and twisted, then it becomes a tool to motivate the people who the religion is the last word, the last authority to them. And I think this is what is happening in Russia. It's being used as a tool to motivate the people to go and fight to defend their holy Christian faith.
Actually, this fact that you've got so many people within the Christian church that are acting in a non-Christian way has been a reality ever since. I think we just didn't realize it. Jesus uses the parable of the weeds. In the parable, the advice is don't go on and plucking out the weeds now, because there is a danger that with the weeds you may pluck out, normal plants. Leave it until the end, and then everything will become obvious. And I think the message is sometimes when you look at the church, it's not easy to say who's a follower of Christ and who is just taking the trip, benefiting from the advantages of being part of the community. There may be all kinds of reasons why someone is part of the Christian community, but it's times of terrible oppression and persecution, or times of tragedy like the war in Ukraine, that actually bring forward in a stark contrast who's who are embracing the values of Christ and who are embracing a different set of values. And I don't say that in a spirit of judgment, because hopefully many of those that I think are definitely not following Christ in their attitude to what's happening in Ukraine will repent and will change their minds and will change their direction. But we also shouldn't close our eyes to the fact that, yes, in times like these, sometimes it becomes very, very apparent that within our communities, there are people that are claiming to be Christians and yet do not resemble Christ. And I think this is where there is a place for us to be offensive. Not in judging, not in condemning people. Yes, praying for them. And of course, if someone is a supporter of Putin, but I see that they don't have food, I'm going to give them food to eat. I will show them compassion. But I will also, which is probably this lady in Romania was saying, I will tell them the truth in the sense that I will say, you are on the side of evil. Unless you repent and change your mind, unless you change your ways, you are actually supporting evil. And you look at the atrocities that are taking place in Ukraine, children are being murdered. The fact that bombings are taking place on weekends, at night, calculated times when they would, have the largest effect on the peaceful population, not on military targets. All of these things show, they have nothing to do with anyone that has anything to do with Christ. And so how can a Christian, a true follower of Christ, look at these things and say, yes, I'm in support. The Ukrainian deserve it. Jesus would never take such a side. Whatever he was, whatever you think of him, it's clear. He said, let the children come to me. He had compassion on people that were suffering. I think it becomes very clear that yes, sometimes even the official church, and you said the Patriarch Kirill, the official Russian Orthodox Church, is officially taking a nationalistic stance, pronouncing all kinds of stupidity, like guaranteeing the afterlife of soldiers who fight against Ukraine. That, even from a theological standpoint, is outrageous. And so we come to a point where sometimes the official Christian church, the official Christian leadership, has nothing to do with Christ.
Just to verify one fact, when it comes to religious freedom, for example, there is a huge difference between how the Ukrainian government and Ukraine is treating religious freedom and how Russia is treating religious freedom. I mean, Ukraine, we can definitely say up to the beginning of this war, and I hope it's still relevant today, Ukraine has been, I would say, for that part of the world, the model of religious tolerance and religious liberty. For example, this town of Bucha near Kiev, they used to call it, maybe still, the Vatican of Ukraine, just giving an idea how basically all different denominations and churches would have their educational institutes and institutions and colleges and churches there on one location, and kind of one place would demonstrate diversity of a Christian presence in Ukraine. And so that's the Ukrainian story. But when you look at the Russia, in the Russia proper, maybe not that bad, but there is a lots of discrimination between who is legitimately allowed space on Russian territory as a religious group. But when you take about those provinces that have been taken by Russia, there is definitely an oppression coming from the Russian side towards anyone who is not a Russian Orthodox there. There is definitely. So this cannot be compared. Russia and Ukraine, when it comes to religious freedom, those two countries cannot be compared.
And I totally agree. As someone, having at least part of my life lived under communist Bulgaria, and I have a lot of friends in Russia, nowadays Russia, evangelical Christians, the attitude towards the Protestant churches, and not only, but I'm using just them as an example. The attitude in present day Russia is just the same, pretty much the same. Occasionally there may be superficial differences, but essentially it's the same as under the communist regime. So Putin is just essentially bringing Russia back towards the days of communism.
And now towards the end, the question comes, so what are we as the followers of Jesus to do in this situation? I know there is an easy answer. We need to pray. And we do pray. But I'm just thinking, how many times saying we need to pray is just a means of putting the issue aside because it's too complex. It's too challenging. It's asking us probably for some next step. And we don't want to do anything with this whole situation. So we can only say that we are praying for peace. We are praying for peace.
I even think that sometimes the response, we need to pray, is also a sign of hypocrisy. Because I haven't met a single follower of Jesus who faces the circumstances we are in, and the war in Ukraine, the atrocities that are being done, and doesn't have the natural impulse to pray. So there is no reason to say that. Like you say, we are praying. That's taken for granted. We're taking it for granted because it's a natural response. There is exclamations, there's questions towards God. We're asking for help. We're asking him to intervene. And all of that comes naturally. We don't have to hear sermons about it. We don't have to remind ourselves of it. It's there. The circumstances themselves are calling for it. So I agree. What else can we do? My conclusion has been it's a time to be very blunt, very to the extent of even being offensive. Of course, I'm assuming that we're all self-critical enough and humble enough to realize that even if I see more than someone else, even if my position, is morally right, I think, compared to the morally wrong position and stance of somebody else. That doesn't make me necessarily better. I'm still a follower of Jesus. There's still plenty of things to repent from in my own life. So I'm not puffing myself up. But taking all of that for granted, taking all of that in mind, there is a place to be blunt and put things into a stark perspective, because the times we're living in call it. Call things evil, good things good. And because we've focused on some of the evil, we see evil reactions, evil moral choices that are being done. We also need to pay some attention to the incredible good that is taking place as well. I was astonished, but in November, the manager of one of the well-respected Bulgarian publishing houses, in his capacity as an individual, started a campaign for raising funds in order to buy energy generators for Ukraine. Within only, I think, 2 weeks, he had collected the amount of 250,000 euros. There is no organization behind him. There is no foundation, nothing. He posted it on Facebook in his capacity as an individual who is well known, because he writes, he takes stands on many issues in the society, so he's well recognized as a name, but nothing else than that. He's just a well-known personality. The only difference is that he would post detailed reports every other day, or a few times a week. This is how much money I received in my bank account. I think he would provide reports, screenshots of the reports from his bank account, but just the way he reported things were with so much detail, in such a way that he gained the credibility before many people. The campaign continued towards the end of January. I think he had collected over 1,200,000 levs, which is about 600,000 euro. At the time in December, at one point in December, he had sent, as a result of that campaign, over 400 generators, which was more than the state of Germany had sent Ukraine at that point. Of course, Germany pledged a lot more. They're going to send a lot more, but it was just ironic that at this point in time, just a single point in time, a single individual in a country where our president is more or less officially taking the side of Putin, playing the neutral card, but it becomes clear that he's compromised. He's playing on the side of Putin, effectually. The government is, because of political processes taking place in our country, the government is also under the influence of the president. So we're living right now in a period of time where both the president and the government are more playing their cards on the side of Putin rather than against him. And yet, in this situation, a single individual raised up his voice and managed to do an incredible feat. And there are a lot of Bulgarians that have donated to him, a lot of Bulgarians donating for generators, stuff, taking care of Ukrainians. We have a few Ukrainians living in the country, but there have been families that opened their houses, empty apartments, that had a spare room, invited a Ukrainian to live with them. A lot of them non-believers. So on the positive side, it's obvious that in some cases, people that are not claiming to be Christians are embracing the values of Christ and are living them out. But even in this situation where things are not the way we would like them to be politically on a government level, I've seen a lot of individuals who've opened their hearts and helped. I'm seeing the same thing now in response to the earthquake in Turkey. So on a positive side, I'm grateful for that. I'm seeing that Christ manages to touch hearts even outside of the church. So I think at this point, we just have to continue doing what we can, living the values that we've embraced, and speak about things the way we see them, be open for correction, but not be afraid to offend someone, because there are plenty of people that need to be offended.
What encourages me is that also there are very bright, inspiring examples among Christians, the way they treat the whole situation. As I mentioned a few months ago, I was visiting Romania, I was visiting Moldova, and I visited briefly Ukraine too. I was honestly encouraged by what I saw done, not by big mega organizations, but by first responders coming from people, Christians, who realize that actually their duty at this time is to find a way to help Ukrainian refugees, not only Ukrainian refugees, but also Ukrainians across the border in the country there. So I had the opportunity to see how different groups are cooking meals on a daily basis for Ukrainian refugees. Some of them doing twice a day. I heard the stories about how in some cases, one organization even paid for rent for 1 year for some Ukrainian families and say, we know it's not easy for you. This would give you time to, if you decide to stay here, to settle and organize your life, for example. I saw the churches which were giving, making their rooms a part of the church property. Maybe those rooms were offices or some retreat rooms for visitors, making available to refugees. So, I saw Christian-based non-profit organizations with a focus on working with, for example, with Romas or with specific needs of their own communities, who at that time have quickly rearranged their work and made them available to Ukrainian refugees. So I saw this over those several weeks that I was there. And to me, this was inspiring. This was inspiring. In Moldova, the same. I mean, this is a poor country with only a few million people, but those people have walked an extra miles comparing with their population and the number of refugees they have accepted. Certainly at that time, last summer. And, I could see very affluential Catholic organization putting itself into service to refugees and their rooms. I've also seen a Baptist church where basically the church throughout the week serves as a place where refugees are being taken care of. The benches are moved around, and the families. And, before Sunday comes, everything is being rearranged for the church service. But then after the church services are over, everything is being rearranged so it serves those families. And in Ukraine, we visited a town which was just across the border, one of those places that have not up to that time been attacked. Concretely in Chernovitsy, I hope I pronounced the place correctly. And I met the people who are, I think, the founders and working for the Bread of Life, also a faith-based NGO, who are collecting food and everything, and then they're taking this to those parts of Ukraine which are not safe. So these are some of the illustrations that quickly now I remember that I saw during our visit there. You don't need even big organizations. Individual small groups can become in many ways some kind of even first responders and be available and do good work for those places that are suffering. And concretely, Ukraine is a place of suffering. It's not the only one, but definitely it is a place of suffering at this time that seeks and needs our intention. As followers of Jesus, we need to be creative in how we are going to be available and help those people, because this war is going to last, it seems.
And to add to that, even one more aspect is with the earthquakes taking place 2 weeks ago, I was informed that there were Ukrainians taking the initiative to send experts and assistance to the regions which were hit by the earthquakes. So, it's heartwarming to see that they're not only, focused on their own suffering, but are very much compassionate to others as well. And you brought the example of Moldova. I think that needs to be emphasized a lot, because Moldova indeed took a significant percentage of the immigrants coming out of Ukraine went there. And it's a poor country, a lot poorer than any of our countries. And yet, I know of many Christians there that are actively ministering to the immigrants and have taken care of them. So yeah, there is a lot of positive examples, a lot of good being done, from followers of Christ who are openly so. So I even think that the negative examples are actually fewer in number, but they're just shocking. We wouldn't expect to have them, and so it's easy to focus on them and pay them more attention than they actually deserve. But yeah, thank God there's a huge army of followers of Jesus that are in their place and doing wonderful things.
Thank you, Andrew, for this rich and tough conversation. I think we had to have it, although not everyone might like it. And we do agree that, yes, there will be many Christians and non-Christians alike who have, over the past year, been doing a lot, walking extra miles, devising the ways, being very creative in bringing and delivering and providing help for the Ukrainian refugees, but also for the victims of the war who stayed in Ukraine and who have been enduring this nightmare for the past 12 months. But my friends, if you are one of those struggling with seeing this war for what it is, a wicked aggression of one country upon another, and innocently proclaiming your neutrality in the whole matter, the moment this war is being called by its proper name, or something in you is triggered whenever someone is expressing sympathies and empathy for the victims of the war in Ukraine, then maybe it would be good for you and for all of us to reflect on the words of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. Friends, we are not peacemakers if we declare evil to be good or simply pretend not to see it. Truth matters, especially in the matters of brutal aggressions and wars, because they cost many, many, many unsuspected and innocent lives. Let me, in conclusion, bring back this lady from Ukraine, who I met with my friends last summer as we were together working with the refugees from Ukraine, who, when we asked the question, what would you do if suddenly a Russian would appear here? Would you help? And after a moment of hesitation, she said, I would help. I certainly would help, but I would tell him the truth. They must know the truth. The Russian people need to know the truth of what their government has done to us, to the people of Ukraine. She repeated that several times, and I would say it is not only that the Russian people need to know the truth, which certainly they do, but everyone else, whether in the Balkans, whether in the rest of Europe or USA, who for some reason do not want to see the truth about the Russian aggression. And let me suggest, more often than not, it is not that people cannot see the truth, but that their own allegiance to some other local or regional agenda or a grievance or desire for vindication would not let them release their hearts of empathy towards the real victims of this war, who are the people of Ukraine. And yes, also the victims of this war are the people in Russia, who by now have been taken a hostage by their government. Let us examine our hearts, friends, and see what is hiding behind very much pious-sounding proclamations of neutrality. When neutrality means only empowering further the aggressor. May those who have ears hear, and may the Lord bless you. And may the Lord end this war very soon.